We're delighted to have Martin Wolf as our guest today on Global Money Talk and Sompro TV. Martin is the chief economics commentator at the Financial Times. He was awarded the CBE Commander of the British Empire in 2000 for services to financial journalism. Prospect Magazine described him as the Anglosphere's most influential finance journalist. Harvard President Lawrence Summers has called him the world's preeminent financial journalist. And Mohammed El-Arian, former CEO of PIMCO, said Wolf is by far the most influential economic columnist out there. He is the author of 5 books, read philosophy, politics, and economics at Oxford, and received a master's in economics at Oxford. Martin, thank you for joining us. I'm excited to get your perspective on key geopolitical and economic issues that challenge us today.
It's a great pleasure to be with you.
Well, someone brilliant once said, "May you live in exciting times," and that wasn't perhaps a compliment or a curse. We have to decide which, but we are certainly in very exciting times. And one of the things that I'm very happy to have you is I think you'll be able to give us a different perspective. And in the U.S., we are famously sort of U.S.-centric, and we're in our own echo chamber, and it serves us well to be able to hear what other folks in the world are thinking about us. I want to get right to it. And the war in Russia and Ukraine, or in Ukraine, invaded by Russia, has challenged us for the past 3 years. And I want to be provocative and say, what do you think of the idea that the saviors of Europe might actually be Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump? The stunning surprise of Russia's invasion and Trump's reversal, the post-war Atlanticism that supported NATO. Is that a wake-up, ultimately for Europe, which for 75 years, clearly chose butter over gun?
Well, so first of all, and this actually fits with your opening, my memory, but you might be more expert than I am, that the "may you live in interesting times" is the way I heard it. Was actually an old Chinese curse, which might be completely wrong, but that's what I was told. Anyway, for me, that fits very well with the way I think about this. Everyone has their own background, and I was born in 1946, which is a very long time ago, immediately after World War II, and my parents were both refugees from Nazi Germany, which is very important in explaining my thoughts about many things like this. And basically their entire families, their wider families, were killed in the Holocaust. So I find the idea of interesting times or exciting times of the kind you mentioned instinctively frightening. So I generally feel that praying for some incredibly exciting event because you will rise to the occasion and it will transform you is a slightly infantile attitude to life, because it might just end up by ending the world. And we are more able to do that now than ever before. In recent thinking, and I mentioned it in one of my columns, I did a little bit of research on what serious people think global thermonuclear war would do to the human population, true thermonuclear war. And the analysis I saw, which was from a reputable American university, said it would kill about 6 billion people. So there's a degree of excitement we really don't want. And I do feel at the moment we are very close to more excitement than we want. But, and in this case, it's because Russia is, of course, a country with about 5,000 nuclear warheads. The US, much the same. That's enough to, as I said, exterminate most of humanity. And when you start getting head-on war, close to war, it gets very frightening. And by the way, this is one thing on which I really agree with Donald Trump. One of the things I rather like about him is his big difference from the would-be dictators of the past. He really doesn't seem to like war, and that's a very good thing. Now, the question is whether, despite my anxiety about where we are at the moment, the amount of global disorder on economics, politics, and so forth, will this be good for Europe? Well, there are two questions there, really. Is this a genuine challenge for Europe? Absolutely, without a doubt. And not just Ukraine and America's recalibration of its commitment to NATO, which are obvious, profound challenges to post-war Europe and its desire to be peaceful, and particularly post-Cold War Europe. What you say about defense really wasn't true prior to 1991. The Europeans spent a lot on defense, and the Germans had a huge army. The bulk of the troops confronting the Soviets in Germany were German. Please remember that. They had a conscript army. The British had a large army there, and so it was an alliance. Of course, the Americans had the dominant weight of power. They were richer. They had all these nuclear weapons. They didn't really want Europe to integrate militarily, by the way. They resisted that very strongly in the 50s. People seem to have forgotten that. But why shouldn't they? It's a very long time ago. But the basic point is this was a fairly equal alliance given the concentrated power of America until the Cold War, when we decided history was over. Some other people did, and that's a lot of what has happened in the last 30 years. History is now back. It's also back in a very big way in economics. Perhaps we'll discuss that later. So the Europeans have to decide what to do. So what I would summarize it by saying the Europeans are aware they have a problem. They don't know whether and how to ensure their own security. They are clearly unprepared in terms of the money they're spending, in terms of where they get the troops, and in terms of providing arms of all kinds, because they haven't really oriented themselves to that. And to create a really large army would probably require conscription, which would be very, very difficult, very, very difficult in a number of countries. Then that's the challenge. Will they rise to this? At the moment, I would say it doesn't look very likely. There's a lot of rhetoric, just as a lot of rhetoric about economic reform and economic dynamism. But in the end, Europe is, 27 members of the EU, very different countries, very different histories. And then there's the UK too. It's an awful lot of countries to herd together. And admittedly, only a few, maybe 5 or 6 matter, but even that is a lot of countries to combine. And there's no natural leader, as there is in NATO, with the overwhelming dominance of America. It's obviously the leader. There is no natural leader in Europe. And the European Union as such, even more Europe as such, doesn't have an integrated command outside NATO. And that's still dominated by the Americans. The command of NATO is still with an American general. So it's a very big shift. And then there's also the economics of it. They'd have to raise more money. That means cutting the welfare state or raising taxes, both desperately unpopular. The politicians aren't ready for this. And finally, in every European country that matters, there's a very significant populist movement, generally, but not exclusively, right-wing populist movement. Quite a lot of these people actually rather admire and like Putin. They don't want to fight for Ukraine. Their attitudes are actually a bit like that of the administration about it. So if you add these things together, while it's clearly a very major challenge for Europe, there's no doubt about that at all, I think it's very unclear whether enough will happen for Europe to be able to defend Ukraine, meet the challenge on its own. There will have to be some American involvement, particularly American arms, American intelligence, American willingness to put pressure on Putin. Without that, I don't think this is going to work. But with that, I think it might.
So I do want to move on to economics, and I guess the question is related, but also quite important. And you just touched upon it. So has the Trump restoration, if we'll call it Trump 2.0, permanently changed how the UK and Europe and perhaps the rest of the world view the United States, or is it perhaps the night terrors will end in 3.5 years, and whomever the next president will be much better, or is this Does this change? So what do they think? And will this permanently change the international view of U.S. assets and whether or not they will continue to fund our ever enlarging budget deficit?
Well, the answer to this is we don't know. But I think, or we don't know in the sense we really, really don't know what's going to happen in the US.
We don't either.
That may not matter for your question, because what has happened has unambiguously vastly increased the range of possible outcomes. So if you asked somebody who followed international politics, both economics and international relations 20 years ago, so let's say 2005, whether what we are now seeing could happen, I think the overwhelming majority, I mean, just 99.5% probably, maybe I'm exaggerating, of foreigners, whether they were friends or foes, would sort of immediately say, it's impossible. That can't happen. Because it amounts to a decision by the US to change in very profound ways, not just its domestic polity, which is obvious, the way the government operates, so forth, but essentially to demolish most of its post-war commitments. What it has been. Question the alliance, question its commitment to liberal economics, question its commitment, above all, to liberal trade, the question its commitment to a whole range of international institutions that it created. They're its creation. So this is even in 2000, with George W. Bush charging all over the world, trying to spread democracy by force of arms, when commitments to NATO were unquestioned, hostility to China, yes, was there, but within an alliance context, the commitment to the WTO, all these things were unquestioned. So what we have realized is that the assumption that those commitments were rock solid was wrong. It just was simply wrong. Now, and once you've seen that, you'll never go back to the complete confidence you had in the opposite. So we now think America is not what we thought it was. Now, then you raise the question, okay, does that mean we know what it will be? Does it mean we know it will be Trumpian? No, we don't know it will be Trumpian. I personally think it's very likely it will be, that the shift is going to be enduring. But I could be wrong. Of course, I recognize that. But even if other forces win now, that is to say in the next presidential election, there's a reversal for a while. Well, we've seen two things. We've seen America change all its views on these matters and its actions. And we know that the current administration is backed passionately, fiercely by a very large number of Americans, close to half. Now, maybe that will dwindle, but it's an enormous number. And these people have very, very, very different views from the traditional Republicans. That's gone. Ronald Reagan isn't around. So we have to assume that these forces will remain very powerful, even if they are defeated in the next election. Big question. And they could come back. They might come back in a different form, but they could come back. So we have to assume not only that this could last, but even if it doesn't, it could come back again. The America of the period from, let's say, Pearl Harbor to 2016 has just gone. That confidence in that has gone because the political forces within America are profoundly different from what they were then. Just the move from Mitt Romney to Donald Trump as the Republican candidate was itself absolutely colossal event. So my assumption is we don't know what will happen, but what has happened is big enough to make us quite sure that we cannot assume that what will happen is that we're going to go back to the status quo ante. That seems incredibly unlikely, but to my mind, inconceivable. So we have to assume that from now on, and perhaps for a very long time, we don't know how long, future policies of the United States will either be like this, or they will be highly embattled, or perhaps to some degree a bit of both.
Will they still buy our debt? I guess is the
then the question. There are many questions there. First of all, the U.S. remains the world's strongest economy, the strongest currency, and that's a tremendous asset. And there are no good alternatives. It's very important. And though we can't rely on it in the old way, it's still the most important potential ally around. And most countries want to continue to have good relations with the US. And that was shown in the trade negotiations, even if they hate what's happening. And even China wants to have workable relations with the US. So I think that if the US doesn't do anything really crazy, people will continue to buy U.S. debt, rely on the U.S. dollar, rely on U.S. capital markets, faute de mieux, in the absence of anything better, as it were. You can't beat something with nothing, and there is something else. There's an important qualification to that. That depends on what the U.S. now does. This is a famous Winston Churchill quote, although it's attributed to Winston Churchill, that the U.S. always does the right thing in the end, though not before first exhausting all the alternatives. So I tend to assume that in the end, Mr. Trump and his team will not make a laughingstock of American monetary policy and pursue what I think of as a Latin American populist monetary system like Argentina's. That sort of seems to me inconceivable that the American economic and financial establishment and corporate establishment will allow that to happen. But if it does, creditworthiness would be destroyed.
Well, it's I wish very good health and prosperity to Scott Bessent, who seems to be the most sane mind in the administration certainly in terms of finance. And I take heart that 10 years ago, Greece was practically defaulting, and now their 10-year debt is about where the U.S. is. So people do forget, and at the end of the day, our capital markets are so big that if you want some real return and some reasonable safety, not a lot of it, not a lot of other debt to buy. I
agree completely, but it does depend on Mr. Trump not doing some of the crazy things, to put it bluntly, he's talking about.
I love your analogy about Richard Nixon as well. That's apt, and I don't think many people, unfortunately, my generation, I'm a little too young to remember Richard Nixon.
There are very few advantages of becoming ridiculously old and still working, but one of them is that you remember very, very well episodes which are very similar. Richard Nixon, from my personal point of view, was infinitely preferable to Donald Trump. That's my personal view. But as personalities, as somewhat authoritarian figures who wanted people in the administrations to do exactly what they wanted and doing. He introduced wage price controls. He was monstrously interventionist in the economy, and he suborned the Federal Reserve. He's clearly, as a figure, far and away the most like Donald Trump, at least in the last century. Strikingly.
I wish we had another hour to discuss it, but in our last few minutes, could you briefly give us your view, and it's only a few minutes, on China in terms of, has that government, that combination of a totalitarian government trying to run a quasi-market economy, have they finally run into a roadblock that is going to be difficult to get rid of and get around, I should say. And I don't think we'll have time to discuss India. I know you visited recently. Just your quick thoughts on China and India and sort of their path forward.
Well, this is where I really don't know, but I have written and thought about it for a very long time. My assumption is that in both cases, the political forces for working out a way of continuing to progress economically will probably prove overwhelming. Is to say, the Chinese people and the Indian people will not accept being stuck where they are. They're in very different positions, but they won't accept that they will be stuck where they are. And so if the systems they have don't work, then one way or another, possibly very messily, they will be changed, because you can't ignore the desires of more than 1 billion people. So that's my first point. The second point is, in both cases, I think a bit more in China's now, they do have some fairly large problems along with immense strengths. And there are problems of macroeconomic imbalance, and there are problems about working out, in the Chinese case, macroeconomic balance and working out the role of the private sector as against the state. But I tend to think in the Chinese case that I tend to think the government will be pragmatic enough, and is being pragmatic enough, to ensure that if what they're doing now isn't working, that they will have to change. I don't think Xi is Mao at all. And I think he wants China to prosper, and I think he knows that it has to if the regime is to survive. Now, that's my guess. These are guesses, but that's my hypothesis. So, and if they want to change, they sure can. Then China's potential remains, despite all the obvious problems, gigantic. It's still a very relatively poor country with an enormous population, even if declining, of extraordinarily, immensely capable people. I mean, that seems to me obvious. So my view is you bet on China. And I have the same view of India. It's much messier and disorganized, but there are an immense number of very capable, very gifted Indians. We know that. They do very well. Just look how many American companies are run by Indians, right? The idea that they can't get above, their GDP per head in real terms about 10% of US levels. Is anyone going to tell you and believe, are you going to believe they can't get to 30%, which is where China is? I mean, they want it. They've seen it. They have better lives now. In the last 30 years, I've followed India for 60, roughly. In the last 30 years, 35 years, for the first time in the history of India, there have been really significant improvements in standards of living. Not perfect, could have been better. Are they going to be allowed to stop that? No. It won't be possible to stop it. So one way or another, India again will find a way through this and it will continue to develop. So my view is the West, I've written this many times, we have to bet on these countries succeeding and others, but these are the most important, and we have to adjust to their succeeding. And the idea that we can, or should, but we can, and this is, I think, a craziness of some in America, not, I think, Donald Trump in his favor, that we can stop it somehow, that China can be derailed. I think it's crazy and also utterly wicked. So we have to adapt to a world in which these are great powers. And the West, which is 12% of the world's population or so, it's not going to run it as it did 100 years ago or 50 years ago. It's crazy. So my view is betting that won't happen, is that somehow we can prevent it, that the US, with 4% of the world's population, can continue to run the whole world, is absolutely grotesque. And I feel about this very, very passionately, and it's a terrible mistake to think we can go that way, and it will be disastrous for us and I think the world.
Martin, thank you so much for this lovely conversation. I look forward to perhaps having you on the show again. You have so many interesting things to say that I want to think about and unpack. So thank you once again for your time. Much appreciated.